Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're looking at this. The weekly topic that we're going to be addressing in international economics is comparative advantage. And so here's a timely article that goes in a slightly different direction than your book. And so this you might consider the alternative view. So the article's entitled Ricardo's Dilemma, Two Big Problems with Comparative Advantage. This was written by Spencer Morrison as a National Economics editorial on December 13th, 2016. So, for starters, it'll help to define comparative advantage, and we'll do this in class when we meet on June 5th, but it also is necessary to consider the definition to look at this sort of alternative article. So, a definition of comparative advantage is countries should trade stuff that they're good at making for stuff that they're bad at making. Now, one thing to keep in mind here as you read this is, you'll see this in your book. This implies that even if you have two countries like the US and Canada, let's say, and the US is better at everything, if they're like way better at cars and only slightly better at steel, then perhaps the US should go ahead and make cars and Canada should make steel. See the point there? US could be better at both, but it's saying that that doesn't necessarily mean the US should make both. It should find the one it's way better at making and trade for the one that it's better but not so much better at making. Well, according to the authors, and I find this a very interesting point, the reality is that global free trade does not have only winners. There are winners and losers. And the author's question, or the author questions, is the US a loser in this? And one way or the other, many people have implied that maybe the US is a loser. Let's go back to Ricardo for a minute, and we'll be talking about him soon in class. David Ricardo believed, and he was a historical economist, he believed that people love their country more than they love money. So a significant point to this then is he thought, okay, people would never move their factories. And Ricardo was British, so he thought that people would never move a factory out of Britain to take advantage of lower costs in a different country. They would take advantage of lower costs if those costs existed, but they would keep their wealth and their factory in Britain. This is proving to be false, and I think you've heard some high-profile stories. Many U.S. former manufacturers are just closing up shop in the United States and buying items from foreign countries. That's right. You might have somebody who at one time manufactured tools. Well, the company keeps its name, but now it doesn't manufacture tools. It simply goes around and gets the best price for tools made in different factories in China. So this basic idea that people would never move their capital because they love their country so much is proving to be false. And that's problem number one with comparative advantage as Ricardo saw it. On a related note, related to that last point, Ricardo argued that capital was immobile, that capital, buildings and machines, could not be moved. Factories couldn't be moved. Strangely enough, this was true in the 19th century when Ricardo wrote it, but it's no longer true. And this turns out to be problem number two. Here's one of those interesting truths that I'm aware of, and I've never heard anybody else say that this is why it happened. But the facts line up, and it's worth considering for that reason. So the author points out that by 1914, 35% of Britain's wealth was held abroad. I have no opinion on that. I haven't independently checked the where the econometrics data came from, but I don't disagree. I do believe that by that time, a significant portion of Britain's wealth was held abroad. But the author then goes on to make a point that because of this, the infrastructure within Great Britain became decrepit. The factories very outdated. And the third thing is clearly true. I've noticed it, and I've noticed when it happened. Sometime between the world wars, World War I and World War II, Britain lost its status as the world superpower. So be careful with this statement. Britain still is a superpower. But between the world wars, for hundreds of years, it was a colonial power. And through World War I, it was the world superpower, and then lost that sometime between the world wars. And the author thinks this situation as early as 1914 caused that. Well, if the author's right, is that happening in the U.S. today? Well, infrastructure is decrepit in many cases. Factories are closed and abandoned, and you can see that particularly in the Rust Belt in the United States. But before you decide that infrastructure is decrepit in the U.S., consider what I get at regarding capital immobility a few slides from now. The author makes a strange case that between 2000 and 2015, the U.S. invested $4 trillion abroad and accumulated $10 trillion in trade deficits. Well, I don't disagree with these statements. Again, I haven't checked the econometrics data, but I don't disagree with the statements. The thing is, America began losing manufacturing jobs long before the year 2000. In fact, when you look at what percentage of the U.S. population was involved in manufacturing, you find a trend that has seen manufacturing falling since no later than World War II. So from 1945 straight to 2017, you see manufacturing as a percentage of U.S. workers declining. My point then is, it'd be interesting to see what would have happened if the author had included 1945 to the year 2000 in terms of what the U.S. invested abroad and how much it accumulated in trade deficits. The author's conclusion is that comparative advantage theory is only valid if capital is immobile. That's something I hadn't thought about before, but it makes some sense. The author concludes that there are three ways capital can be immobile, and two of them are valid. They validate the comparative advantage assumption, and the third one, the author argues, is invalid, that does not validate the comparative advantage theory, and I tend to agree with him completely on this. So first he says, if capital is naturally immobile, then comparative advantage theory is valid. For example, you can't take the coal mines out of West Virginia. You can't take the oil out of the Oklahoma-Texas region. And you can't take away America's fertile farmland, which covers a good 2/3 of the country. So, Americans can be expected to hold comparative advantage in mining and in agriculture, because things other than moving the factory would cause comparative advantage differences. Second, the author argues that immobility is irrelevant. If immobility is irrelevant, then this is also a valid or an assumption that validates comparative advantage theory. So the classic case is Boeing, several years ago, was located in Washington State and moved sizable portions of their factories to South Carolina. And Boeing has contracts with the U.S. military, so they would not very easily be able to leave the United States and go to China or somewhere else because of low costs. So the author says, well, Washington and South Carolina are both in the United States, so if infrastructure leaves Washington and goes to South Carolina, then it still stays in the U.S. Well, I don't disagree with that, but I'll tell you, as I look at the picture of what's happened in terms of jobs leaving the country and types of industries leaving the country, what you'll notice is in the earliest days, the factories left the Rust Belt and moved to the Sun Belt. And there, very often that was happening because air conditioning got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and so you could encourage people to work long hours in the factories, and the weather inside the factory was conducive to that, and it hadn't been before air conditioning. And second, you could avoid labor organization in the North. But what happened next then is, in many cases, that same infrastructure that went from north to south then went from south abroad. Takes you back to where is where are the factories decrepit in the United States? Are they decrepit at all across the country? Are they decrepit only in the Rust Belt? Is this point that the author's making accurate? And here I say, personally, I don't know if it's in the United States' interest to allow the Rust Belt to be decrepit and the Sun Belt to be strong, or Washington to get decrepit and South Carolina become strong. But then the author concludes with, if capital is only artificially immobile, this does not validate comparative advantage. So the author talks about how if tariffs, quotas, and other protectionism is used to keep factories from moving, this will be self-defeating in the end. That now, while these factories still might serve American interests, nobody else through the world will use them because they don't have comparative advantage and they're expensive. Americans are being forced to use them in this theory, but nobody else, which means, of course, Americans would pay a higher price. Well, something new to think about and something to compare to our in-class discussion on comparative advantage theory. Take care.